Hi, friends. My name's Lisa Graustein. I'm a member of Beacon Hill Meeting and part of Three Rivers Meeting on Wampanoag unceded land in what's now Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm joined here today by Melody Brazo.
Hi, I'm Melody Brazo. I'm a member of Fresh Pond Monthly Meeting, and I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the other side of the river from Lisa.
And we are starting a series of videos at the request of some folks in New England Daily Meeting to talk about, as white people, how can we engage in racial justice work at this time in our nation. And in preparation for this video, I put out a post about this on Facebook and just invited people to ask some questions. And so we took 3 questions from the many that came in to start our conversation today.
And so the first question is how to work through and overcome the feeling of doing this wrong and letting people down and maybe people not liking you. It's a question that I hear not only from people in Quaker settings, but a lot in sort of the conversations I'm having with other white people right now. And I think it's also underneath that is a question about shame, about how do I carry the fact that I don't know stuff that turns out, or that I learned stuff that turns out to be really wrong. How do I carry that without feeling shame about it and being paralyzed by that shame? And I think a lot about the fact that we are purposely taught a whole lot of stuff that's wrong. White people and people of color, we all are educated in a system that is made to perpetuate a series of lies and misinformation about who we are, how we got here, and what we all deserve. And some of us learn to peel back the layers of that sooner than others. And, there's this thing about how you can't know what you don't know. And so one of the ways that that system perpetuates itself is by making you feel like it's your fault that you don't know what you don't know, and so you should be ashamed because you should have known it, and that's what keeps people from wanting to learn, and from asking questions and from asking each other for help. So a big piece for me of working through feeling like I'm doing it wrong is giving myself encouragement and permission to just be a learner here, and to feel like I can be honest about what I don't know, and I can question the things I thought I did know, because as I've gotten older, so it's become so clear that in so many big and small ways, the things I thought I knew turn out not to be true. And so that makes me question the other things I thought I knew. And that often actually brings me to a way better place when I can work past that shame part.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that, putting yourself as a learner and as a listener and as someone who is curious about what is there, as opposed to just staying in that shame place. Because for me, one of the other things that I think about the way that white supremacy has conditioned me to talk about race and be in multiracial spaces is to always prioritize my own comfort. And that if I feel bad, I get to do something that requires other people, particularly people of color, to do something to make me feel better. And when I can recognize that I don't feel good, and before I act on that, say, why don't I feel good? And ask that question from a learning perspective, I start to see some of the ways the system is set up. Right? And that we as white people had to position our own comfort constantly to do, for generations, all this violence to all these different groups of people of color. That there's no way that that's actually tolerable to a person who's fully intact with their humanity. And so we had to sort of learn all these ways to push our discomfort away, or to make other people want to make us feel good about ourselves. And so for me, when I think about that feeling of doing it wrong, so often in me, that's not because I'm deeply worried about harming somebody else, it's because I don't want to be seen as bad, or I don't want to feel bad about myself for having done harm, that it's still very focused on me. And I think you're positioning yourself as a learner, right? I have to look at my own process, but it means I have to be curious about things. I have to ask why I'm doing something. I have to ask, what am I prioritizing here? Whose comfort, whose best interest? Um, what might other people need? And is it really about how I want to be seen, or is it about what's actually happening in the moment?
And and I think one of the things that I've learned from uh, from my colleagues in this work, in sort of anti-racist work, is to when I don't understand something, to go to the place of wondering. Like, I
Mhm.
wonder about this. I wonder about my reaction.
Mhm.
Um, and it's not it's not always the first place I go. So I go to that place of discomfort. I go to that place of shame. I go to that place where I'm centered, which doesn't make me a bad person. It just means I can't stay in that place, and I can't inflict that on other people.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's important to understand that it's not like you're going to get someday to being some fully evolved person that no longer feels shame. It's just that you're going to get to a place where you notice shame and you can step past it sometimes if it's a good day, you know?
Yeah. I think that's actually a beautiful lead into the next question we got. So I want to read that, and I'm curious what your response is. So the question is, how to sit in discomfort and not center myself as a white person, even if I'm having strong emotional reactions. How to interrogate strong emotional reactions in myself in a way that does not take away, take from, or do harm to Black, Indigenous people of color in the room, space, or conversation. So when you notice that shame coming up in you, Melody, like, what are the tools or skills that you employ in that moment to be present with yourself, but not then center your kind of white shame in a multiracial space in a way that isn't beneficial for the group?
Um, well, I think the first thing I do when I notice that is just take a really deep breath and let myself feel it,
Mm-hmm.
without necessarily telling everybody they have to stop while I feel my feelings, you know, but it's really important to feel it and to acknowledge it to myself. Like, that's information. If I'm feeling all of a sudden washed over with shame, there's something happening and I need to pay attention. And and very related to that for me is feeling washed over with anxiety, particularly when somebody, particularly a person of color, expresses anger
Mm-hmm.
about anything.
Mm-hmm.
It is hard. It is hard to sit with people who are angry in any context, and particularly, I think, if we are a lot of white Quakers really equate peace with no conflict, right? So we see ourselves as peaceful people, and then somebody is in front of us and they are raging, or they are grieving really loudly, or they are, you know, taking up a lot of space with their feelings. And um, I have a very deep, long time education as a white person that says that is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
You are not supposed to be showing those kinds of emotions. And so my training did not teach me how to be with that in myself or in other people in
Mm-hmm.
very useful ways. Um, and one of the things that over time I have learned is how to honor shame and anger and conflict as opportunities for learning and change. And that has been a really hard thing for me to do. And it has not been a total straight line from there to here. And even now, I can't always do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel as though my shame and my anger are important pieces of information for me that can help me move to some uh, other place that's more useful if I feel those things rather than tamping them down. And I also will say that when I am sitting with someone else who is having really big feelings, I've learned to see that as a gift. Like somebody feels like they can have those feelings in my presence, and rather than be scared by that, and rather than try and make it go away, if I can welcome it,
Mhm.
um, I can receive the gift that it is
Mhm.
in a way that honors the other person.
Mm. I really like that. When I think about this question, I think about the times when I've been in some group setting and have said or done something or have some realization, and I feel that deep sense of shame. And for me, it's like a visceral sensation that grows out of the center of my chest that all I want to do is shut it down. Whether it's like, no, it's not there, let me go find a piece of chocolate, like whatever it is that kind of cuts that off because I don't want to feel it. And so I think similar to you, what I've had to learn is like, all right, let me like breathe a deeper breath into that feeling. Let me feel that, like, and it feels like dark, oozy, mucky stuff moving through my body or something. Like, how do I like let myself breathe into it until it is fully moved into my body and I can feel it and then I can start to release it. But when I try to just shut it down, it it always comes out sideways and often in ways that then creates more moments for me to feel shameful about. And when I think about this question about in that space when we're with other people and we don't have the luxury of just being at home and being able to process, um, I think about the very few times I've had the wherewithal to say, like, I'm feeling really ashamed or I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Are there other white people who will step in with me once we leave this group to name it? Because almost always when I'm feeling it, somebody else in the room is feeling it, or they have felt it recently enough that that is actually an affirmative statement for me to make with other people in this space. It acknowledges it without centering it. It asks for support, which I think as white people, we don't do enough around how we're experiencing our own race, racism, other people's racial identities. And I think about the close white friends I have where I can say, all right, I totally screwed up in this thing today. Can I just talk with you about it? And they're people I trust to not just say like, oh, no, no, but you're a good person. It's okay. It's okay. Let me just like do that, like make you feel better motion, but really like, yeah, that was a big thing and can engage with me. Like, so how did it feel? So what did you do? So how did you move? Um, because I think those are questions we need to ask each other and ways that we can step in with each other in that space. And I think when we're in a multiracial space in the moment, there's so many factors to pay attention to. So I think about what are other people in the space asking for? What's the purpose we've come together? And is my saying something in service of that purpose or not? I think about when other people in the group, particularly Black, Indigenous, or people of color, have asked for something, is my is my what is being asked of me and how can I respond to that in a way that is both authentic and honoring of the request, and if I can't, to acknowledge that so it's not just met with silence, and then where and how I move with other white people in the space. Like many times I'm in discussions or workshops and it'll be me, it'll be somebody else who has kind of one of those moments and is visibly upset and is crying. And I think because there's been a lot of talk about like white women's tears, we're like, can't go near the white woman who's crying or must center the white woman who's crying. And I think like, can we just be human? There's a way that I can go and put my arm on someone and still stay involved in the conversation, acknowledge care for them as a human being without centering that dynamic. And when I think about it that way, I think, oh, right, in any other circumstance, if you were crying in a group, I would want to check in with you. And if it wasn't appropriate for the group, I would say, great, let's follow up later. Or how about I sit with you and hold your hand and we're going to keep going.
Mhm.
And so I think we have fallen into this like, either it's totally centered or we have to completely ignore it versus like, where's the human space to listen for what people need and how we do still know how to be human and compassionate with each other and with ourselves, which is also what I heard you talking about in like feeling your feelings. That's an act of compassion.
I also will say that there is certainly a segment of white people culture that um, that really wants to erase um, big feelings of any kind. And if you are someone who grew up in, say, an abusive family, or somehow you've come to adulthood with some trauma, um, it's likely that part of how you survived that was that you just took it and put it somewhere and didn't deal with it, right? I speak from deep experience here. And that's a really useful strategy when you're in a situation that you have no control over and you have to survive it. It's not a useful strategy for an adult who's trying to navigate complicated social interactions in the world. And lots of us use that strategy so well and so completely that we are not even aware we're using it. And it's really hard to unlearn, and it's really scary to unlearn. And it's not, I don't want to go into a whole long thing about it here. It's a whole different conversation, but it so interacts with the way that white people feel that this is really hard and complicated, this whole conversation about race. And it connects with the training a lot of us got about like not seeing color and race not being something that was polite to talk about. And so there can be a lot of emotional homework to do in the background of doing work around dismantling racism for white people.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the trauma. I also think about as a woman who went to a pretty high-powered college, how many messages I got about that if I didn't say it exactly right, I was discredited for the rest of the seminar or the class or the year. And then when I think about it as a queer person, right, if I don't, particularly because, and you and I are different generations, but when I first came out, I was the only openly queer teacher in the school I was in. And so if I didn't do it right, it had pretty dire consequences for me. And then also when I hold up those consequences around the realities that Black, Indigenous people of color are dealing with every day, pretty different too. And so where I try to use that as a jumping off point for bravery and compassion. And I also just want to say, I have been slightly distracted since I spoke a few minutes ago, because when I was talking about the feeling of shame moving through my body, I used the word dark. And I was like, oh, did I just equate darkness with badness in a conversation about racial justice? And how much that has already distracted me from the conversation of, are people going to hear this now? Are they going to turn off this video and not listen to us anymore? And where I'm just trying to move that to like, okay, that's noticing, that popped out. There's more stuff to do there. I can say that to you and we can keep going. And I still have value to add to this conversation and what we're doing.
Right. And I think in my work with educators, I say all the time, if we can't model making a mistake and then recovering our balance, how do we expect children to learn how to do that, right? So here we are, completely, I can't think of the word, filled with our own foibles, right? We don't have it all together. Right. And so, yeah, that's how it is. And we have to be able to regain our balance and keep going, because we are going to make mistakes and we are going to say things we're sorry for. And that's part of the process. And I'll say also that another part of white culture I find is part of that sort of like needing to be perfect or you shouldn't even do it, right? And that stops. A lot of people I know this week have said to me, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Well, but that means you're saying nothing. That's way, way worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's maybe move to our next question then, because I think that's also another, you get these beautiful transitions into our questions. Do you want to read this one?
Sure. Being a witness and listening and or speaking up in solidarity. So for context, there's been a few group conversations where Black folks have led the conversation, but white folks were quiet until being asked to speak because the absent silence was felt. This may just circle back to the question about doing it right or worrying about saying the wrong thing. Do you want to start?
Sure. So I think it is related to doing or saying the wrong thing. I mean, I can think of many, many times I've been in those situations where a Black person or another person of color has said something pretty strongly, and it feels like the people of color are all jumping in, and I'm like, well, I have nothing to offer this. Oh, but I should say something. Oh, but maybe I don't want to say that, and I just get in this head trip. Um, versus again, when I can get back to like, what is the person in front of me asking for, human to human, and then what is a person of color asking for me of a white person in this space? And I think a lot of the things, you've talked about how we've been trained, right? I was trained to share, well, let me share a parallel experience to show that I empathize. But when we're talking about race, I don't have a parallel experience as a white person. And I think in a lot of spaces too, often we like to say, well, as a woman or as a queer person, and there's parallels between racism and sexism and homophobia, but they are not the same, right? And I'm also always still a white woman and a white queer person. And so I think looking at what is my impulse versus what is being asked of me, and trying to figure out where those two do or don't line up. And one of the things that when I think about when I have shared hard things or difficult things or challenging things, the first thing I want is acknowledgement, like that I have said something that is true and real. And as a white person, I can always acknowledge that I have heard somebody say true and real. And I don't have to do that by overlaying my own stories on it. I can say, I just heard you say this. And when you said this, like I could feel the energy crackle across my body. I felt tremendous sadness that I've been a part of this thing that has been hard for you in our shared workplace. That's acknowledgement. And I don't have to fix it. I don't have to come up with a solution in that moment. I don't have to do lots of like, well, I know as a white person, I could never fully understand because I don't really know that, and like put all these qualifiers on it. I can just say, I heard you. And then I can start to think about, what are you asking me to do with what I have heard of you? Are you asking me to own my piece of it? Are you asking me to help problem solve? Are you asking for support? Are you asking for space? The myriad of things that people might be asking for. And those things I can always engage with. So those are the two things that I think about, is like, how do I affirm and acknowledge what I've heard? And then how do I listen for what's being asked for and respond to that authentically?
The other thing about affirming what you've heard, I know from my own experience as a lesbian, in spaces where I felt really alone, that one of the things I wanted when I spoke out was I wanted someone to acknowledge that it took courage to say whatever I said. And so when I think about people of color, particularly speaking in a group where there are white people, I think about how important it is for us to acknowledge that that's a risk people are taking. And we think of ourselves, I think, perpetually as good people, right? And our intention to be good people doesn't really translate into safety for people of color. And so it is a risk when people share their truths with us. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And then everything else you said, I totally agree with. I think there was something else I was going to add, but I can't remember what it was now. So that's why that little skip.
One thing I want to build off what you just said about when people of color take a risk, particularly in predominantly white spaces, is one of the terms that is being used right now a lot to talk about it is emotional labor, right? Who's doing the emotional labor to bring up the issue, to push the issue? If an issue targets you and you're in the minority in whatever group, it is much riskier to talk about it than if you're in the majority of whatever the group is or the issue doesn't target you. And I think that notion of emotional labor is really valuable because it can look like, well, you're this confident person and you're just talking, and not that there's actually all this risk and work behind doing that. And I think naming it as emotional labor in spaces, acknowledging it. I know when I've been on managerial teams and it's really clear that there's a few people who are doing a lot of that, we talk about like, well, I work in schools mostly. Do you not have bus duty? Like, do we give you back some of your time? And I think particularly in this moment in our nation where almost all my friends of color that I've spoken with, the emotional labor of opening the newspaper or getting on social media, or I was talking this morning with one friend who I think got something like 30 calls and emails yesterday about, can you explain this to me? Can you recommend a book? Can you come talk to us? Can you, that just even those requests, while they're affirming, acknowledging her skill and her voice and her teaching is exhausting. And so I think, again, as white people, where we acknowledge emotional labor, where we can offer care for people in addition to, like, you did something risky and I know that has an impact. Can I do something for you to show care?
Mm-hmm.
As well as acknowledging it in the spaces is really valuable. And I think particularly in Quaker circles, because in New England, because so many Quakers are white, the friends of color who speak up do so much of the emotional labor on behalf of the entire body over and over again, and then get bombarded with more questions and more pieces. Can you do this? Can you do that? I disagreed with you. And so where we show that solidarity, where we care for people, and where we as white people step into raising up those risky issues. So it's not always falling on a few people's shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else about this topic that we want to add before we close out this conversation?
I just really want to encourage people, white people, to step in without without feeling like they have to be expert first. I just want to go back to what you were saying about having gone to a college that made you feel like you had to be an expert. I think that our entire education system, whether one goes to college or not, it makes people feel like that. Like it is just part of the atmosphere that you're supposed to already have the answer, right? And you get rewarded for already having the answer. And you, even though we say school is a place for learning, it doesn't look like that a lot of the time. And so we all come with this built-in assumption that we ought to know all this already, and we don't. And so it's important to keep trying.
Yeah. And I think where we do that for each other too, so that if I say something that is ignorant or is harmful or wrong, that you come to me not with, you did this wrong, Lisa, and that kind of
Right.
like, I got to tell you why you're wrong, which is a lot of energy that I know I felt early on in my journey. I was like, oh, I know this thing is right and you're wrong. Let me tell you, versus like, I care about you. I know you care about this. Can I help you learn with this? And where we do that notion of eldering, of bringing out the best in each other, of lifting up, of redirecting, of learning, of growing with each other. That is, I think eldering is such a gift in Quakerism that has gotten a bad reputation, but is really about, I care about you enough to be invested in the short and long term with you in this. And also the humility that, while I might offer something to you today, you might offer something to me tomorrow. And that when white folks can step into each other's learning in that way, that's really how we create some broader change and start to disentangle ourselves from all the white supremacist ways that we were taught and trained in and expected to uphold.
Right, right. And that's got to be the first step in dismantling the structures that perpetuate white supremacy, even when all of us good white people keep working on our individual biases.
Right, right. Yeah. Great.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Melody. We will be posting this on the New England Yearly Meeting webpage. If you are watching this video and have other questions you'd like to see us talk about, you can email us at lisa@neym.org, which is Lisa, neym.org. And we're hoping to do some more videos where we talk about different questions that friends raise up. So thanks.
See you next time.
All right, bye.